Philosophers talk to our times. A brief future for history. One of the things I think is interesting, well, just interesting to see it play out actually, is, and I'm going to start off with fantasy and then we'll go back to science fiction because this series is firmly about how humans' desire to live in their own sci-fi is quietly unpicking our sanity, with AI being case in point. It's the one thing that feels like we have finally reached the future. We're not thinking machines. That means we're in sci-fi now. Sci-fi land. But of course it doesn't work like that. Because most AI is a large language model. It's a P super. It smashes and squashes infinite numbers, near infinite anyway, of data in relatively short periods of time. And as monkeys will always write Shakespeare in the end, some of the shit sticks. You can call that intelligence if you like, but I'm not sure what you really think intelligence is. And the point is about all of that is not that that couldn't be a useful tool. There's probably some uses for it. I'm perfectly willing to accept that. I'm feeling rather cynical at the moment. I was talking to one of my programming brothers, and the amount of cold water he can pour on AI is beautiful to behold. But that's not what makes it so tricky. What of course makes it so tricky is that the desire to rush into the future fulfills one of the criteria for Tolkien's definition of evil. One of the things I think that makes Tolkien work as a fantasy writer is he's very good on two different versions of evil. One of them is highly problematic if you're writing fantasy stories, and that's orcs. The problem with the tragedy of orcs is that they are a description, I've always felt, of what the First World War did to humans. The First World War mixed with drugs, how it destroyed their humanity in the end. And orcs are a beautiful description of war's effect on humanity and where it leaves what it is to be a person. It's why the entire issue of where they come from and how they're bred is totally impossible, because they were a fragment of humanity at a certain time, the Great War. But his second real, very accurate, I think, definition of things that become unwillingly evil, because that's usually the way within Tolkien, is that evil is invariably created by those who want to rush into the future far too quickly. It's impatience. It's impatience with a world that unfurls at its own speed, that doesn't go in the direction that you want it to do. Now, you don't need to accept any Catholic ontology in order to be able to see the value of that proposition. The minute you are trying to cloud compel into the future, you're already very impatient with reality. You're at odds with it, frankly, odds with it. And that is always an issue. Because you're always having to force things to conform to your vision of it. And of course that distorts what you think is going to happen. AI is a classic model. What can AI do? It can write short gobbledygook programs very well. It can't research Spinoza to save its life. I'll just tell you that. I've tried it many a time. It's pants at it. It just produces a word soup that everybody else would produce. It can produce very bad art very quickly. So if there's a market for very bad art very quickly, it can do that. Of course it can. And a few other things, but nothing that a good, competent human wouldn't be able to do. I mean, really nothing. You can say, oh, it solved all these mathematical problems. Well, maybe it's produced a solution. I haven't actually gone into the whether they count as actual maths proofs or just things that people say. There's some very strict rules about maths proofs. But the point is that it's not being used for what it could be useful for, which is probably optimizing human labor or human work to make humans can do more. Is not what it is being used for, which is replaced with the idea that it is a thinking machine. And we're all being forced to conform and to keep up with this idea that we must keep up with this new thinking machine because it's the future, because we're already in sci-fi land, and we're prepared to break the planet, destroy water sources, use vast amounts of fossil fuels for no real benefit, other than the vision that this could already be sci-fi land. And that, if you had to understand the tragedy of Sauron in a nutshell, that is it. Wanting to move too quickly, wanting to organize the world too soon, wanting it to conform to a preconceived idea of what will be, of what must be, of what his very reality is, of what that they feel, that power they feel they've been promised. That causes you into acts that run at odds with what actually is happening, with the world in which we are living. And that, for me, is the blight of this science fiction future we are building for ourselves. The point is that we never did enter science fiction land. We never did enter a world where beaming up was possible. Not for anything other than quantum particles, anyway. The world was weirder, more complicated. There were hitches on the way. A warp drive is plausibly impossible. And Martian colonies is always incredibly unlikely. All of that jazz. Okay? And some of those things may be solved in 500 years' time, and some of them may never be solved. But the point is that we're not going to live to see it. And that hard fact is actually something for generations now brought up on science fiction that is actually very difficult to allow. So that we're totally set up into forcing the pace of change, because it is the change we have always promised ourselves. And so here we are, caught up in sci-fi land, trying to force it upon a world that it doesn't fit with. It doesn't end well, this little story of ours. It doesn't end well at any level. The most likely, if I'm really honest, with my full cynical head on, is that it just brings down the corporations that try to do it far too quickly because they've misunderstood the technology, because they don't understand what humans do, because they were always working in corporate jargon anyway, which strikes me as the most likely thing to happen, and a good thing too. Of course, corporations are all part of that, because any corporation is selling a dream. They're always selling the future, because that's what the stock market is. That's why this is driven by sci-fi land. And one of the things that has happened in this stage of, I'm unwilling to really call it capitalism, and you could call it a sort of a feudalism if you must, but I probably wouldn't. I would say this ungainly rush to what we imagine a future could be is that it is driven by stock price. And this is driven by stock price because that sort of fiction is exactly what always sells every single stock price. It's why the AA bubble is such a bubble. It's a bubble that has swept everybody up into this image of the future land in which we are going to live. And so we all need to buy into it, and it becomes its own myth. The difference with, I suppose, the mythical demons of the Lord of the Rings is that they were one person. And this is being kept together not just by the billionaires, but by all of those who have bought their stock, bought the myth. Because, of course, once you're in sci-fi land and all the money is tied up with making it be, the fact that it will not be becomes a horrible, guilty secret. that nobody can quite realise or say because they've invested too much money in it. And so here we are, destroying a planet in the name of a future that we cannot have, for no plausible benefit. Well done, us. It really is the stuff for science fiction if you think about it. Yes, it is a dystopia, but it is something worse than that. It is the final fictionalization of our reality. The world has become, in Nietzsche's words, a lie. As we've fallen so far in love with our dream that we've read all our lives, that we've lost sight of the fact that it always was a dream. The point was not that it could be. That was never the point of it, that it must be. The point is it was meant to teach you stuff about the here and the now, principles about what it was to be human that have long since died in the urge for the run for the future. So, moving beyond this trap, if Sci-Fi Land will always be a question of just waking up and understanding what technologies we do have, the wonderful ways we can change the world, and to fall out of love with all those images, or that world of Martian flight and colonial explanation of the stars. That is not our fate, and we need to accept it to move on.